Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for another live Google Hangout. We're here tonight talking about medicine for real, taxation. Thanks so much for joining us on Google Plus and on YouTube, or if you're watching this archived, it's really great to have you here. My name is Don Duncan. I am the California Director of Americans for Safe Access. We're the nation's leading medical cannabis patient advocacy organization, and we do these broadcasts every now and then to talk to our folks in California about what's going on with medical cannabis for patients, the industry, and other stakeholders. So I want to say thanks a lot for joining us. If you don't know a lot about Americans for Safe Access, I hope you'll go to our homepage, safeaccessnow.org, and check us out. We've got a lot going on there, and we've really got a big mission for medical cannabis, and we are making progress right now at the state and federal level like I've never seen before. So I'm excited about what lies ahead, but we really have some big challenges remaining here in California and nationwide, and so we need your participation, your membership, your support to make things happen for medical cannabis. So I know a few folks are still logging in. If this is your first time to Google Plus, you probably had to download some software. If you're having any troubles with that, you'll see a link to YouTube in the comments fields. And if you're in YouTube, you can go to the comments there and find a link back to Google Plus. I also want to encourage you to look at my comments under the name Don Duncan. They're on Google Plus and YouTube, where you'll find links to important information that's relevant to tonight's broadcast. So thanks again for joining us. We're going to get started. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to log in and is participating now. I'm hoping to speak for about 30 minutes tonight, and then we will have time for as many comments and questions as you guys want to ask or want to say. So let's get started tonight with medicine for real, taxation. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's really important that our lawmakers in California and other decision makers, including voters, treat cannabis like medicine. It's very, very important because medicine and vices are regulated in fundamentally different ways. So before we get to that, I want to talk to you about a brief recap of the history of medical cannabis in California. It's been a long time. It's been, over 17 years now since voters approved Proposition 215. And it's really important that we remember where we came from when we're understanding where we're at right now. Way back in 1996, voters approved Proposition 215, which protected patients and caregivers who used medical cannabis to treat any serious condition for which cannabis provided relief. That was really a landmark moment in U.S. history. It's the beginning of the sort of modern medical cannabis era, where states took the lead and started regulating and licensing and legalizing medical cannabis. But while Proposition 215 was brilliant in its broad, vague terminology, there was also a problem built in there. Proposition 215 didn't say anything about where you should get medicine if you could not or would not grow it for yourself, or have a primary caregiver grow it for you. And so patients had to experiment from 1996 forward with community-based access models, sort of emergency access plans for medical cannabis, because there was not a real legitimate above-board industry, nor were there any local or state programs for medical cannabis. And so patients started to organize together and form things like dispensaries and cultivation cooperatives to provide for their medicine. It took the state legislature until 2003 to adopt the Medical Marijuana Program Act, which is known as SB 420. They claim that was by mistake. I don't know. But SB 420, the Medical Marijuana Program Act, provided some clarity as to how patients should navigate state law. It created the ID card program. It created some short-lived limits on how much cannabis you could possess or grow. Those were subsequently overturned by the California Supreme Court and dealt with a lot of minutia. But most importantly, the Medical Marijuana Program Act recognized collective and cooperative associations of patients. And this was really the legal justification for the dispensaries and the grow operations we see all over the state of California today. They were collective and cooperative cultivation projects, including storefronts, that provided for the needs of patients. We've now moved into a brand new era in California where we're leaving behind our collective and cooperative model. It's been good to us, but it's time now for California to join the 40 other states that have passed medical cannabis laws since California voted back in 1996 with state licensing and regulation, with actual honest-to-God licenses from the state. It's really important for clarity, both for the business and organization owners, for law enforcement, regulators, and community, that we take that final step and actually license and regulate our medical cannabis businesses at the state level. So last year, the state adopted the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, commonly known by the unfortunate acronym MRSA. MRSA is a trio of bills, 3 bills that license and regulate marijuana cultivation, manufacturing, dispensing, distribution, testing, all of these, transporting, all of the things that we need to do in a modern industry to get medicine from the farm to the patients. Now, that bill is imperfect. I know that it is, but it's a big step forward in the state of California. We're going to talk more about that, how this is a step forward a little bit later. But I want to point out to folks who are worried about the progress of state licensing and MRSA that we're actually gaining ground in California right now, because prior to MRSA, there were cities and counties all over the state of California that were waiting for some signal from the state of California about what to do. And right now, today, we're seeing a great expansion in the jurisdictions that actually affirmatively license and approve medical cannabis activity. And that's a big step forward, because MRSA will require local licensing or permitting for state licenses beginning as soon as January 1st of 2018. And so the fact that we're picking up new jurisdictions is a really positive step. And I know for some of you, this progress hasn't reached your city or your county yet. And in fact, some of the most conservative jurisdictions in the state are digging in their heels and refusing to license and regulate. Still going to have to fight. But on the balance, we're gaining ground under MRSA that we never gained under the Medical Marijuana Program Act. And so I look forward to the future as a future where there's broader, wider access to medical cannabis in California, even if it's a struggle here in the short term. So I think the folks should be glad about MRSA and should be really dedicated to working in the cities and counties where we need local access to adopt regulations that provide access for patients. And whether you're working at the state or the local level, you have to remember that medical cannabis is real medicine. This is very important because we're going to treat real medicine very differently than we treat vices like alcohol or tobacco. Let me tell you, now we know this, of course, from our experience, but let me tell you about the research that's been published that deals with medical cannabis use, because research is solidly behind our experience in California about the utility and the efficacy of medical cannabis as real medicine. In 2014, the Drug and Alcohol Review, a scientific journal, published an article called Prevalence of Medical Cannabis Use in California, 2012. This was based on a survey of medical cannabis users around the state. And in fact, this survey was done by the California Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. You may not have heard of that, but what that is an ongoing cross-sectional telephone survey which interviewed 7,500 people all over California, both in English and in Spanish, and they talked to them about medical cannabis and medical cannabis use. It's the biggest and most comprehensive survey ever done of medical cannabis use in California. There have been smaller surveys, but this survey found some very interesting and differing findings. What this survey found is that more than 1.4 million Californians have used medical cannabis as of 2012. That number is almost certainly larger today. Remember, this data is from 2012, published in 2014. So at 1.4 million, that was 5% of the state's population has used medical cannabis. Now, while that doesn't tell us how many are using medical cannabis right now, I think it's safe to assume, and we all know, that a lot of people are using medical cannabis in California. Of those people, of that 5%, that 1.4 million who were using medical cannabis, 92% reported relief from a serious medical condition. Now, if you look at the efficacy rates for prescription drugs, you'll see that 92% is crazy high. That's an extreme satisfaction rate for use of any medicine. What we see with medical cannabis is that people are not having the serious side effects and complications that sometimes make satisfaction rates for prescription drugs much, much lower. And the survey asked people, why did they use medical cannabis? The leading use in California was chronic pain, a condition that afflicts millions of Americans. It's the fastest growing recommendation for medical cannabis and one of the fastest growing diagnoses in the United States. Of chronic pain users, we had 31.2% of the respondents were using medical cannabis for chronic pain. We had 10.7% for migraines, 8.4%, and for cancer, 6.8%. So of those top 4 conditions, that's about 60% of all the medical cannabis users in the state of California for chronic pain, arthritis, migraines, and cancer. The other 40% consist of HIV/AIDS, glaucoma, muscle spasms, nausea, stress, and depression. None of these are minor or trivial conditions, and many of these are conditions for which conventional treatments are either ineffective or unavailable. So a lot of people are using medical cannabis in California, and they're actually getting real relief from these serious conditions. It's important that we know this because you're going to hear some people say that medical cannabis is not real medicine, and the facts show otherwise. A lot of people are getting relief from conditions that are not trivial, that are not minor, but are clearly serious conditions. But there's also a misperception in California that the people who are using medical cannabis are mostly just young white males, and probably they're just getting high off of it. But what the researchers found is that medical cannabis is used at similar rates between men and women, young and old, and patients with both high and low levels of education all over the state of California. And while, of course, from place to place that those numbers vary, that really debunks this idea that medical cannabis is a phenomena where young white males get high and use medical cannabis as an excuse. Now, I'm not going to tell you no one is gaming the system in California. Somebody is, and that is what it is. And in fact, there may be some resolution to that problem when voters go to the polls in November and create a legal and safe path forward for non-medical cannabis users. However, right now, I think it's very clear based on our experience since 1996 and on this survey data, the biggest survey ever conducted of medical cannabis users, that medical cannabis is real medicine and it's providing relief to a lot of people. So the reason this is important to understand up front is because medical cannabis should be taxed and regulated like real medicine, not like a vice. We regulate vices very differently than we regulate medicine. We regulate vices to restrict access and to generate revenue, whereas we regulate medicine to protect public safety and welfare, but not necessarily to generate revenue. So this is a very important distinction for lawmakers to make. We should not be confusing medical cannabis with alcohol, tobacco, or cannabis used for non-medical purposes. Wrote in the survey published in Drug and Alcohol Review, quote, medical marijuana use to treat serious medical conditions and recreational marijuana use are motivated by different factors. End quote. It's very important that lawmakers respect that. We should not confuse legal medical cannabis use with vices. For example, we would never accept a policy in California that put onerous barriers and hurdles to jump over to get to your heart medication. That would be considered absolutely inappropriate. And yet some lawmakers want to do that with medical cannabis. And we would never accept a sin tax on insulin for diabetics or chemotherapy for cancer patients, because it just places an unreasonable burden on people who are very sick and just trying to access their medicine. And so that is a clear example of how we treat and tax, especially medicine, differently than vices. Now, by comparison, of course, we do put restrictions on who can get tobacco and alcohol, how old you can be, where and when you can buy it. And if you use alcohol and tobacco, you know already there are huge sin taxes imposed on alcohol and tobacco. That's a choice our society has made to mitigate the harm of those substances and to raise revenue, but it's not the right choice for medicine. And if you were just to substitute say insulin or heart medicine for the word cannabis, when you hear proposals from state and local lawmakers about medical cannabis regulation and taxation, you can see how absurd some of these proposals are. It's important that lawmakers draw this distinction about medicine for real, because they're going to make some really important distinctions about cannabis in the weeks and the months to come. I was at a hearing recently at an assembly a committee hearing on one of the tax bills, and a lawmaker said that as few as 30% of the patients in the state of California are legitimate medical marijuana users, and therefore it's okay to tax them, because really these are just recreational users masquerading as medical users, and that is just really unacceptable. By the way, that lawmaker offered no proof or statistics whatsoever. So unlike the published survey data from the Drug and Alcohol Journal, this lawmaker was simply relying on anecdotes and a sort of bias about medical cannabis that really should not inform policy. And it's really important that lawmakers hear from us as we move forward in California this year and in our cities and counties in the years to come. They need to hear from us a very, very clear and consistent message. Medical cannabis is medicine for real, and it needs to be treated like medicine for real. When we come to the issue of taxation in the state of California, we're starting to deal with a very tricky issue. Here at Americans for Safe Access, we're not so naive as to think there will never be taxation on medical cannabis. In 2005, we fought with the Board of Equalization over the sales tax applied to medical cannabis. Sadly, they were not persuaded and didn't apply that sales tax to medical cannabis, on average about 7.5% around the state of California. And so that sales tax is already applied, and we know there will be some additional tax in the era of licensing and regulation, but it's really important that the industry and the patients and the other stakeholders of medical cannabis stand together to push back and keep that tax as low as is possible. Now, why do we have to have tax? Well, first of all, that's how the state government works. They always want revenue, and when they passed the MRSA, they were anticipating some revenue. Now, Americans for Safe Access and other advocates pushed back last year and got the tax provisions removed from some of the bills that were adopted finally and became the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. However, there's a new push this year to tax medical cannabis. And there will be some cost. There'll be cost to licensing, issuing business licenses to cultivators, manufacturers, dispensers, and the others. This is going to cost something to the state of California. So that's a revenue need. There are also enforcement costs, because whenever you create licensing and regulation, there are going to be costs to enforce those new rules and those licensing provisions. So obviously there'll be some cost for enforcement. But there's some other things on the table right now, and I want to ask, what really is a need? You know, we have some needs for revenue, but I'm seeing proposals right now that put money to parks and services, and to drug education, and to other law enforcement needs, and even to the general fund. And while these may be needs that the state has, they're not really needs related to medical cannabis. And it's not okay for lawmakers to come in and say, we're going to tax medical cannabis, we're going to put a sin tax on medical cannabis to deal with issues and raise revenue for things that are not related to medical cannabis, and most importantly, not related to the needs of medical cannabis patients. And so you may hear this year many proposals that have these really laudable goals about what they're going to fund. Who doesn't want to fund schools and parks and drug education and treatment? But the fact is, these are not necessarily costs that are related to medical cannabis, and it wouldn't be fair for any other medicine to come in and say, okay, I see you're using blood pressure medicine to keep your blood pressure in check. Well, we're going to put a sin tax on your blood pressure medicine so that you can pay for the parks in California. Nobody would take that seriously, and we shouldn't stand for it in medical cannabis either. Some existing sources for revenue in California that lawmakers can rely on while we wait to see what happens with the current proposals about medical cannabis. For instance, MRSA, the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act, requires license applicants to cover all the costs associated with their licensing. And so we don't really need to tax patients or any specific stakeholder in the medical cannabis industry right now to cover those costs, because the Department of Consumer Affairs will have a loan to pay for its upfront cost, and then the license applicants, the people who go in to apply for commercial applications, will rightfully bear the cost of issuing those applications. And so we do not need patients to pay for that. The license applicants will pay for it. There was a bill adopted last year called SB 165 that imposes additional civil penalties for marijuana cultivation, presumably, hopefully, marijuana cultivation that's happening inappropriately outside the scope of the law. And so that marijuana cultivation, those medical marijuana cultivation fines will be used to pay for environmental remediation and enforcement for harm associated with medical cannabis cultivation, or indeed other cannabis cultivation in the state of California. And so there's another source of revenue where money is flowing into the state to help them fund their enforcement efforts. We also have taxes adopted last year by the water boards in California, which will now be issuing some permits and fining people and assessing fees for marijuana cultivation, especially outdoor cultivation. And remember, we still have sales tax in the state of California at an average of 7.5% or so for medical cannabis, which is pouring money into the state general fund right now. And so increasing compliance with sales tax laws could it bring even more revenue into the general fund if we insisted that every medical cannabis dispensary uphold that law and collect and pay that sales tax. Now, I'm not a fan of sales tax, but if it is the law, I strongly recommend that every medical marijuana facility pay the sales tax that's due so you don't wind up in trouble, and so that you provide that revenue that may forestall some other kind of more onerous collection like these taxes that are proposed. So having said that, let's take a minute to look at two of the current proposals that are before the state legislature right now. Both of these proposals, by the way, have already cleared policy committees and financial committees. They are on their way already to the appropriation suspense file and finally to floor votes in their respective houses in the Assembly and the Senate. When I say the suspense file, what I mean is that these are revenue bills that are being held until the end of May, until May 26th, so they can be voted on by the Appropriations Committee with all the other revenue bills. Now, typically, the Appropriations Committee might kill a bill if it costs too much money to the state of California. But bills that add revenue tend to have an easier time in the Appropriations Committee. And so we have to be very careful about these bills. We have to push back on the tax bills because the state legislature likes revenue. They really want this tax money. And these bills have momentum. And so it's very important that we stop them, if we can, at appropriations, or if we cannot, on the floor of each house of the Assembly and the Senate, so that they don't move on in the process. Remember, after each bill clears its house of origin, it moves on to the next house, the Assembly to the Senate, and the Senate to the Assembly. And it's much easier to stop a bill in its house of origin than it is to stop it in the next house, because when it goes to the next house, it has momentum from committees and from the floor vote. So we need to push really hard on these two bills. The two bills I'm primarily concerned about right now are AB 2243, Assembly Bill 2243. This is by Assemblymember Wood. He was one of the co-authors of the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. And while he is a big proponent of medical cannabis licensing and regulation, he's looking for revenue in this bill. This is a bill that, as amended, will place a tax on the distribution of medical cannabis. Now, if you've been following the story, you may have heard that AB 2243 would put a tax on the cultivation of medical cannabis. I'm happy to report that that tax burden has been removed by amendment and is now on the distribution side. And while that's a little bit better, it still means that that distribution tax is going to be passed on to the end consumer. This distribution tax, by the way, is $9.25 per dried ounce of medical cannabis, not pound, but ounce. It's per ounce of medical cannabis. That's a pretty high tax, 5 to 10%, depending on what the pound price of the ounces are. There's a $2.75 tax on marijuana leaves, on cannabis leaves. So these leaves that will be sold for processing into cannabis products would have a $2.75 tax, a huge percentage of their overall wholesale value. And there's a $1.25 tax per cutting that is received by a distributor. So these are pretty high taxes. And even though you may say, oh, those are taxes that go to a business, to a middleman, they can afford it, every cost we put on every step of the medical cannabis industry is going to flow through ultimately to the consumers. So that's $9.25 an ounce extra that a medical cannabis patient will pay for their medicine at the end of the day that they don't have to. And remember, these taxes are in addition to sales tax or local taxes that are already assessed on medical cannabis. And remember, cities and counties are already taxing medical cannabis. And so they may have taxes of anywhere from 5 to 15% at the local level. And both of these bills would be in addition to local tax and sales tax. So that's AB 2243. It is currently in the Assembly Appropriations suspense file, and it's going to have a vote on the last week of May. So it's really important that we're ready for that vote. The other bill is SB 987, perhaps an even more onerous burden on medical cannabis patients. This is a 15% tax on cannabis consumption in the state of California. It's an excise tax on the retail sale of medical cannabis to patients. And this 15% tax is on top of any other state tax already assessed. It's on top of sales tax, and it's on top of any other local taxes that your city or your county already imposes. So for instance, in Palm Springs, where tax is at 10% already, this would essentially be a 39% tax on medical cannabis. And so that tax is really, really big, and it's much bigger than what we're seeing for end users in places like Colorado, Washington, and other states that are really pioneering cannabis and medical cannabis licensing and regulation and legalization. And so we do not want to see a 15% tax on patients in the state of California. Both with AB 2243 to a certain degree and to a much greater degree with SB 987, is a stacking on of taxes that is going to push legal patients out of the legal regulated market and back into the unlisted market, which is exactly the opposite of what MRSA was designed to do. We do not want to be pushing patients back into the unregulated market where there is no quality control and there is no benefit to the state and increased safety for patients and communities. We want patients to use the legal market, and they will if the taxes are reasonable and fair. But if we put this kind of a sin tax on top of medical cannabis, an extra 15%, then we're going to see patients abandoning the legal market in droves to go back to the black market, and we may actually sabotage and shoot our legal system in the foot if we adopt these taxes. SB 987 is also in the Senate Appropriations Committee. It's in their suspense file. It will also be up for a final vote and go to the floor at the end of May. And so we need to tell Senator McGuire, who's the author, also a co-author of the MMRSA and a champion of regulation and licensing, but we need to tell him on this score, he is simply not looking out for the benefit of patients. And we need to find a better way, a fair and a reasonable way to fund the revenue needs of the state without putting that tax on patients. By the way, there is no agricultural product in California that is taxed the way that they propose taxing medical cannabis. And these kind of sin taxes of 15% on medical cannabis are absolutely unprecedented in the state of California. And so we need to push back on AB 2243 and SB 987 and make sure that they are not adopted as laws in the state of California. I'm going to talk to you about what to do as we wrap up this broadcast in just a few minutes. Before we move on to the final topics here tonight, I want to encourage you that if you have comments or questions you want to share, whether you're on YouTube or Google+, go ahead and type those in, because it's time to start getting those in queue, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can, so be patient. I only have about this much space on my screen to see your questions, so be patient while we scroll through and find all of the comments. But go ahead and start typing, because we're going to be wrapping up here in the next 5 minutes or so. So you might be asking at this point, well, if taxation at some level is inevitable, what does reasonable taxation look like? Because we can't always say to lawmakers, we don't want this, we don't want this, we don't want this. At some point, we have to come to the table and say what we do want in the state of California. And so there are some things that I think a reasonable tax policy looks like. It's hard to find the actual number of taxation right now because we don't have enough data. And that's why we say that these taxes are too high and too soon under the AB 2243 and SB 987, because we need to know what local governments are going to do, and we need to know what's going to happen with the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, which we'll get to in just a moment. But we need to know those things before the state comes in and starts stacking on taxes in addition to any other taxation. So I believe that a fair and reasonable tax policy would treat medical cannabis like real medicine. My absolute ideal situation here is that medical cannabis would be subject to no taxation. But barring that, we have sales tax already, and we should put off the other cost of licensing and regulation onto applicants for commercial licensing and onto businesses and organizations that apply for licenses under MRSA and have no additional taxes for medical cannabis patients. We would also have a tax policy in California in an ideal situation that considers the cumulative burden of taxation when assessing cost or fees or taxation at any level of the medical cannabis industry, whether that be cultivation, manufacturing, distributing, or what have you. Lawmakers at this local and state level need to always consider the total cumulative impact. What we need to find with this ideal tax policy is what I call the sweet spot. This is a spot that meets the revenue needs of the state of California, but also incentivizes participation inside the legal system. I don't know what that sweet spot is in California. We need way more data and real world experience before we know what it is. And that's why ACE is calling on lawmakers this year to wait. Do not adopt taxes on medical cannabis right now because it's too soon. We need to wait, and we need to see what's going to happen with other taxes at the local level and at the even at the state level before we start stacking on any additional taxes. And by the way, in terms of waiting, local governments bear the burden of enforcement under MRSA. They're the ones who have to go up and check on the licensees and make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed to do. And given that, it's really important that the state give cities and counties a year or so to assess their own revenue needs before the state comes in and starts gobbling up revenue. That's why, by the way, the California League of Cities, one of the most powerful lobby organizations in the state of California, is opposing the tax on patients right now because they know that eats into what cities need for their programs for medical cannabis patients. Now, before we get to what you can do, I want to talk a bit about what's on everyone's minds, I think, and that is the Adult Use of Marijuana Act, AUMA or AMA. AMA is a voter initiative that is just announced. The proponents have announced that they have enough signatures, in fact, way more than they need, 600,000 signatures, to put a legalization initiative on the ballot in 2016. Now, I know there are a lot of opinions about the AMA and legalization and all of that. We're going to revisit that later in the year and talk more about it. But what's important to know about AMA tonight is that it assesses a 15% tax across the board on medical and non-medical cannabis. So that 15% would replace SB 987. The author, Senator McGuire, had the good sense to make a provision in his bill that says it's either AMA or SB 987, but not both. But it's still a 15% tax across the board. Now, the good news in AMA is that it repeals sales tax for medical cannabis. And so for most patients, depending on the city or the county, you'll be paying about the same amount of tax. You'll be paying 15% AMA tax, but minus 7.5% or so, depending on your city, in sales tax. So it'll come out to be a savings of sort, even though, frankly, it's a net gain in tax cost for patients. And so it's not all bad news on taxation under AMA, but it's really important that we still be aware of this as we move forward in this debate about local and state taxes. That 15% may be coming. Polls look likely that this thing is going to pass in November and that tax will be imposed. So we've got a lot of pieces in play. And so I'm going to ask folks to help us advocate with lawmakers to wait. Just take a break and don't adopt any new tax bills this year in the state of California. So what can you do? That's really the key question here. And I want to encourage everyone to bookmark on their computer safeaccessnow.org, because the first thing that you can do is sign a petition opposing SB 987, that's Senator McGuire's tax bill with a 15% tax. About 800 people have done it already. If you're one of them, thank you for doing it. If you haven't, go to safeaccessnow.org, and then you'll see a tab there that says Advocacy. And if you pull down the Advocacy tab, it says Take Action Now Online. And when you see that, when you pull that down, you'll find an action alert to oppose SB 987. We need many, many signatures. I'm going to be sending those next week to the Appropriations Committee. I would love to have more than 1,000 signatures on that petition to oppose the 15% tax. So if you haven't done it, get online and oppose SB 987 so we can have your voice when we talk to lawmakers about it. The next thing you can do is to make plans right now to come to the California Citizen Lobby Day. This is an annual event. We want to bring hundreds of patients and industry workers and other advocates to Sacramento on May 23rd. That's 2 weeks from tonight. So it's coming up really soon. So you need to get registered. It's important to register in advance because we need your home address, because we're going to make an appointment for you to see your California Assembly member or senator or their staff in each of their offices. But we need time to make those appointments. So go to californiacitizenlobbyday.org. You'll find a link in the comments section on both Google Plus and on YouTube, and go ahead and get registered. We're asking for a $40 donation, but nobody will be turned away for lack of funds. That $40 donation covers the venue rental, the catering, the printing cost, and the other expenses associated with hosting a lobby day. It's going to be at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. We'll meet there in the morning. We're going to have a continental breakfast. We'll have a briefing and a citizen lobbyist training, so you know what to do when you go to your Assembly and Senate offices that afternoon. And we have some really special guest speakers. I'm happy to announce that Lori Ajax, the chief of the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation, will be speaking, and Anshi So, who is the senior policy advisor for the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation, will both be speaking there. And so you can get information about California's new medical cannabis laws straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. They'll both be there to talk to you. You'll also be hearing from ASA Executive Director Steph Scher, who's flying into California to talk to you about the new national and international frontiers about medical cannabis. It's a big day. After the lobby day, it ends with a very special VIP reception with lawmakers in the 15th floor of the Hyatt Regency. There's a panoramic view of the Capitol building. We'll have some complimentary hors d'oeuvres for you, a cash bar, and you'll get to rub elbows with some really important people, advocates, and lawmakers and their staff who are working on medical cannabis issues. So I really want to encourage you to go to californiacitizenlobbyday.org and get signed up right now for that event, because it's going to be a really important moment where we can oppose taxes, we can oppose other bad bills, and support proposals that are beneficial for patients. So please make it a point to come to this. It really, really matters how many people we put in the hallways. It shows lawmakers that there's a constituency that's watching from their district and that they care about medical cannabis. And so that's really, really important. I also want to encourage all of you and to promote Americans for Safe Access in this lobby day. If you're not a member of Americans for Safe Access, we need you. We need your voice. We need your participation. We need your membership fees to do important work like the lobby day, like opposing tax bills, supporting good proposals, educating constituents all over the state of California. And so if you're not a member, go to safeaccessnow.org and join Americans for Safe Access tonight. We really, really need your help to make sure that we can do this important work to promote the rights of patients, promote access, and make sure that we have a voice right here in Sacramento where laws that affect your life are being made. Now, there's more going on in Sacramento. There's a drugged driving bill that's coming up that could make criminals out of patients. There are cleanup bills and reforms to the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. And we are proposing a bill for next year that will prevent discrimination against patients in employment, housing, access to health care, and parental rights. And so all of these things are still on the table. So we want to make sure that we have as many people there to work on that. You're going to hear a lot more about those bills as we get closer and closer to the California Citizen Lobby Day, again on May 23rd in Sacramento. You've got to get registered at californiacitizenlobbyday.org. And remember to register early so we have time to make appointments for you. So that is about that we're coming very close to the end of this broadcast. If you have comments or questions that you haven't typed in yet, now is the time to do it, because if we don't see any popping up on the screen soon, I'm going to wrap this up. I do want to let you know that we need help promoting the Lobby Day. We have these great posters and we have flyers. Click on the links that are in the comment fields of the Google Plus and on YouTube, and you can find out more about how you can help promote it. And if you still can't find enough information about how you can sponsor, get flyers, or find posters, go ahead and give me a call at 916-449-3975. That's 916-449-3975. You can also email me at Don, D-O-N, at safeaccessnow.org, Don at safeaccessnow.org, and I can get the flyers, posters, or whatever else you need, including, by the way, a copy of the study that we've been talking about tonight. We have plenty of copies of these to share with you. So go ahead and get registered, get in touch, get active in this campaign to protect and to expand patients' rights, and we're going to make a big impact in California on May 23rd. By the way, that those appropriations committees are 4 days after. The final votes on these bills are 4 days after our lobby day. So this is a really strategic time to be in California and to stop this unreasonable taxes and put this off until next year. So I want to say thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for participating. Thank you for coming to the lobby day and helping us stop unreasonable taxation on medical cannabis this year. So if I see no other comments or questions, nothing's popping up, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up tonight. If you have additional comments or questions after the fact, you can put them on Google Plus or on YouTube, and we'll try to get those answered as quickly as we can. Thank you again for joining me. Look forward on our emails and on our blogs and on the California Weekly Roundup for more announcements about the California Citizen Lobby Day, which is 14 days from today. It will all be over. So be a part of that and help us make a difference in California. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Have a great night.